I'm Hannah Reed, 35 years old, and I never thought a birthday gift could bring the police to my doorstep just 30 minutes after it appeared. Right on the doorstep, a brown paper-wrapped box sat quietly. Printed label, no handwriting, no card. Ethan, my husband, picked it up with a frown. "Don't open it." I laughed, but the look in his eyes caught my laughter in my throat. A tiny mark in the corner of the shipping label instantly pulled me back to that stifling apartment smelling of cellophane and glue, the place I swore I would never mention again. My phone buzzed, and the screen lit up with the word Mom. Before I tell you why that gift sent chills down my spine, comment below if you've ever received a gift you shouldn't open, and hit like if you believe some gifts are best left unopened. That birthday morning, as I stood in the familiar kitchen, the scent of coffee drifted through the air and the soft hum of the toaster filled the space, I realized just how much I had come to love mornings with Ethan. There were no raised voices. No tears shed from trying to please someone. Only peace, the kind I once thought could never belong to me. But peace, sometimes, is the most fragile thing, because all it takes is a small crack in memory for it to slip through. My childhood was not a string of quiet days. My mother, Margaret, had a very clear way of dividing her world. Claire, my younger sister, was the delicate one who always needed protecting. I was the strong one, the one who would take responsibility for any trouble. When the antique vase broke, I was the one who had to apologize. When Grandma's sweater got stained with paint, I was the one who washed it. When Claire decided to start a bath bomb business and failed, my mother handed her $600 without hesitation while I got a long lecture about being independent. I used to think I'd grown accustomed to that role, but those memories never truly went away. They simply lay dormant under a layer of dust, waiting for a reason to resurface. And that reason was always tied to Claire. Especially the smell of cellophane and glue, that suffocating scent that clung to my lungs every time I stepped into her apartment. Back then, every corner was piled with rolls of wrapping paper, open bottles of glue, her hands always marked with bits of paper and streaks of white adhesive. That smell wasn't just unpleasant, it felt like a sign, an invisible warning I wouldn't recognize until many years later. Once, I asked my mother, "Why is it always me who has to take the blame?" She looked at me, her eyes both tired and resolute. In this house, being strong means taking the suffering for someone else. That answer was like a period at the end of a sentence, closing off any further argument. When you're a child, the words of an adult aren't just truth, they're law. And that law followed me into adulthood, shaping the way I stayed silent, the way I endured, even when I didn't have to. Maybe that's why mornings with Ethan felt so precious. Here, I didn't have to be strong to carry someone else's mistakes. I could simply be myself. But the irony was, the more I cherished the present, the more I feared the past might find a way to shatter it. And then, a year ago, an invitation to lunch, a seemingly harmless gesture, did exactly that. It opened a door I had worked for years to keep locked, pulling me back into scents, glances, and choices I wish I never had to face again. That afternoon, the early winter wind whistled past the row of red brick houses, carrying the smell of dark roast coffee all the way to the sidewalk. I pulled the glass door open, the small bell jingling, and the warmth inside the cafe wrapped over my coat, shoulders still dotted with fine misty rain. The yellow light spilled down onto the polished wooden table as if it had just been varnished. In the far right corner, by the window, Claire was already waiting with a steaming latte and a thick stack of documents neatly tucked under her elbow. "You're here." She smiled, lips painted a light brown, the faint trace of lipstick left on the rim of her cup. The smile flicked on like a switch, polite enough to make me feel like a stranger. I hung my coat over the chair, pulled the chair out, its legs scraping lightly against the wooden floor, then sat down. Claire had already tucked back a strand of hair from her ear, the glossy gel nails of her hand tapped lightly against the folder cover, a small thunk, the rhythm of someone about to present something. We exchanged a couple of quick pleasantries about the weather and work. The barista set a cappuccino in front of me, thick foam dusted with a thin ring of cocoa powder. I thanked her, turned the cup handle slightly, letting the heat warm my fingertips. Claire glanced at her watch, then leaned forward, her hand pressing down on the stack of papers. "I need a favor." "Just temporary," she said, her voice dropping half a tone, as if afraid someone might overhear. I didn't answer right away. Outside, streaks of sunlight trembled through the branches, casting shifting patches of light and shadow on the table. Claire unclipped the folder, pulling out a few A4 sheets with a minimalist logo and a pale beige stripe. When she drew out a thicker stack of prints from her tote, the crinkle of coated paper sounded dense, the faint scent of glue wafted up, mingling with coffee, making my throat catch for a beat. That smell, the smell of coated paper and glue, had followed me like an invisible shadow for years. I placed my hand on the table's edge to steady myself. "I'm opening a small studio." "Applied arts, nothing complicated," Claire said, laying out each sheet like a vendor revealing samples. "To work with the supplier, I need a stable address to register the license. You could lend me your name and address just to be the listed name, make the paperwork easier." "Temporary." She slid a blank form toward me, the signature box glaringly empty, lying there like a deliberate silence. I skimmed the printed lines, the words authorization, temporary co-ownership buried in fine print. Her hand had already set down a ballpoint pen, the click of the tip sharp, like a signal to begin. "In your mouth, temporary means how long?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the signature box. Claire blinked. "A few months. Maybe a quarter. Depends on the supplier. They're a bit strict." She smiled, trying to lighten it, then leaned closer, lowering her voice even more. "You're the most stable one in the family. People feel reassured when they see your name." Her phone buzzed. Mom flashed on the screen. Claire hesitated just long enough for a breath, then answered, putting it on speaker. Margaret's voice came through, warm and smooth, like icing on an overly sweet cake. "Have you met with her yet?" "Hannah, is that you? I just want to remind you your sister is so close to an opportunity. You're the stronger one, help her this once. It's nothing big." I looked at the cappuccino in front of me. The foam had sunk a little, revealing the dark coffee ring, like a circle quietly shrinking in on itself. From the phone speaker came the faint clink of a spoon against a cup. Mom was probably home, kitchen lights on, everything arranged to her liking. I inhaled, held it, then set the pen down, not touching the form. "Mom," I said evenly, "have you read exactly what you're asking me to do?" On the other end, Margaret paused for exactly a second, then chuckled softly. "It's just registration paperwork, honey. Put your name on it for now, we'll change it later. You've always been good with paperwork. In this family, whoever can do something should help. That's what family is." "How long is temporary?" I asked, repeating myself, but this time to both of them. Claire cut in, "We've talked about this, I just need your name to get the first contract. The suppliers are picky, I don't want to miss this window. People do this all the time." I remembered the smell of coated paper and glue in her apartment, rolls of paper stacked like towers in the corner, an open glue bottle tipped on its side, the dry glue crusting into white flakes like chipped paint. I remembered other temporary favors, holding her spare keys for a week that turned into 3 months, covering a deposit she forgot to pay back, and the countless times I'd heard just this once until it lost all meaning. The barista came back, setting down a small water carafe. She glanced at the stack of papers, then looked away. I thanked her, poured water, the faint scent of lemon rising. Amid the cafe's layers of aroma, the smell of glue still refused to fade. "Just sign," Claire murmured, sliding the pen closer, the click of the tip sounding again. "I'm more than halfway there. All you have to do is put your name down." I set 2 fingers on the form's edge, pulling it to the center of the table, as if realigning the conversation's balance. I looked straight into her eyes. In your mouth, temporary means how long? The same question, but this time I let it stand alone, long enough, clear enough, that she couldn't sidestep it. Claire pressed her lips together. On the line, Margaret exhaled, the sound brushing against the speaker. Hannah, Mom said, her voice no longer sugar-coated, this is a small matter. You're the older sister. You're stronger. Don't make things hard for family. I'm not making things hard for anyone, I said gently, eyes still locked on Claire. I'm reading carefully what someone wants to put my name on. I pushed the folder back toward her. Not hard. But final. Claire stopped it halfway, her nails tapping thunk again. She swallowed, and I saw her narrow shoulders rise, then fall. One signature, Hannah, Margaret said. Don't be so cold. I'm not cold. I was calm. I'm clear-headed. Silence for 2 beats of my heart. Outside, a bus pulled up to the curb, people stepping on and off, the door folding shut with precision. Claire picked up the pen, turned it between her fingers, then set it down. She smiled, but it only made it halfway. If you won't help, then forget it. I get it, she said, pulling her phone off speaker. I'm busy. I have to go. I opened my wallet, set my coffee money and a tip on the tray. It's on me. The words fell as lightly as courtesy, but I knew they were like all the other times, I was always the one covering the final part of these temporary things. We stood almost at the same time. Claire slung her bag over her shoulder, clamping the folder under her arm. As she walked past, the smell of coated paper and glue trailed behind like a thin wisp of smoke. I watched her push the glass door open, the cold rushing in before it closed again. The bell chimed once more, ringing like a period at the end of a sentence. The cold didn't stop at the cafe door. It followed me home, seeping into the weeks after like an underground stream. That year's Christmas card never made it to my mailbox. The family group chat went silent, then one day, my name disappeared from the family projects list without a word. Dad sent a New Year's email, ending with, "Hope you learn to support instead of obstructing." I stopped reading there, set my phone face down, my palm slightly damp. On Instagram, Claire unfollowed me quietly. Photos of her outdoors with new shipments, captions about big opportunities and family support. Mom commented with a heart and a "so proud of my daughter." I scrolled past like I was walking through a strange room, everything still familiar, but the chairs had been moved, and where I used to sit was now a potted plant. One afternoon, I ran into Margaret at the supermarket. She was picking out a bouquet of daffodils, her face tilted under the cold fluorescent light. I said hello, she nodded politely, then glanced into my cart. "Is Ethan doing well?" she asked like small talk, then, before I could answer, added, "A good daughter knows how to sacrifice. Don't let outsiders laugh at our family." I knew exactly who the outsiders were. Or more accurately, I knew exactly where my place had been reassigned. The cold stretched through January, February. A cousin's birthday invite went out, my name wasn't on the list. An aunt called to suggest I should be gentler with Claire. I nodded vaguely, hung up, then wondered when gentle had come to mean sign for her. If you've ever had a family member ask you to just put your name down in that sugar-wrapped voice, you know the scraping feeling in your chest when you have to say no. It's not loud. It's the swallowed hitch of breath, the small cut just beneath the sternum. And if you've ever been there, stay with me because sometimes, a boundary needs proof to be respected. I started doing little things to remind myself, sticking a note that said "don't sign for others" on my notebook cover, deleting a few relatives' numbers who texted on Mom's behalf, moving family emails into a separate folder so they wouldn't ping my phone. Each act was like placing another brick in the thin green wall I was building around my life. Not to isolate, to define. One rainy night, Ethan and I washed dishes together. The water was warm, soap bubbles clinging to our wrists. "You okay?" he asked, not looking up, just holding out his hand for the plate I'd rinsed. I nodded. "I'm learning not to feel guilty for protecting myself." Ethan smiled slightly, our eyes meeting in the brief reflection on the stainless steel sink. "Good," he said. "Every wall needs primer." A year later, on my birthday, the doorbell rang, and on the doorstep sat a plain brown box. Printed label. No handwriting. No greeting. I hadn't even lifted the lid when the smell of coated paper and glue crept up my spine. That gift dragged every memory back whole, damp, and unmistakable. And that's when I knew the cold hadn't just lingered. It had peaked. A year later, the birthday gift had awakened it all. That morning, the late winter sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, quietly spilling across the dark wooden table. I was making coffee when Ethan walked in from outside, holding a brown cardboard box with no sender's name, only a machine-printed label, neat to the point of coldness. He set it down on the table, tilted his head, and touched the corner of the postage stamp with his index finger. "Look at this," he said, his voice lower than usual. "This supplier is Claire's." I froze for a moment. The tiny italic letters in the corner of the stamp looked like some kind of secret code, and only someone who had worked in the industry or had handled Claire's shipments would notice. A shiver ran down my spine. I set the coffee spoon down, stepped closer, my fingertips brushing over the surface of the cardboard. The glossy outer layer felt slightly rough, and the smell of glue mixed with the scent of industrial printed paper seeped into my nose, acrid and dry, as if it had just been pulled from a batch still warm from the press. There was no address for my parents' house. Only a P.O. box in another state so far away it couldn't have been by chance. My phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Mom. I looked at Ethan. He gave a slight nod, signaling me to answer. I swiped my finger and lifted the phone to my ear. "Sweetie," Margaret's voice came through, drawn out and soft like sugar dissolving in hot water, but to me, that sweetness was burnt sugar, leaving only a bitter aftertaste. "Have you opened it yet? It's a gift of love." I glanced at the box. The top was sealed with brown packing tape, the cut line perfectly straight, as if closed by hands far too practiced in packaging. I swallowed hard. "Yes, I've opened it," I lied, trying to keep my voice even. Margaret chuckled lightly, the kind of laugh from someone who believes they've tied the perfect knot. "I know you'll like it. Love isn't always sweet, but it's real. Just keep it, okay?" We said goodbye, but when I hung up, my mind still echoed with that word love, strange, hollow, and loaded with implication. In my head, I could see Claire clearly, sitting in a room filled with identical brown boxes, the yellow light casting down, rolls of packing tape scattered beside a box cutter. She bent forward, cutting tape, pressing labels, and when she stacked each box neatly, her lips curved into that slight, knowing smile. "This supplier knows who opens the package," Claire had once said to me, showing off her latest batch of products. Back then, I thought she was just bragging about her customer service. Now, that line felt like a small blade slicing through my memory, sharp enough to raise goosebumps along my arms. I stepped back, leaning against the kitchen counter. The box sat still, like a small animal pretending to sleep. The smell of glossy paper and glue wasn't just strong, it seemed to spill into the air, filling the space, cutting off my breath. "A gift of love," I murmured, eyes fixed on the box, "or a trap of family ties?" Ethan stood beside me, his gaze tightening. "We don't have to open it. Not until we're sure." I nodded, but my mind was tangled. Not opening it was still an answer, and I knew Claire would notice right away. If what she'd said was true, her supplier would report back, maybe through a text, maybe a phone call, or worse, a move I hadn't yet imagined. We set the box aside, trying to go on with our morning as if nothing had happened. But I realized I was pouring coffee into the same cup 3 times, or had I already added sugar? Everything felt slow and muddled, as if something unseen was siphoning the air from the kitchen. I was about to step out into the garden for some fresh air when suddenly, a knock at the door. 3 raps. Short, firm, and strong enough to make the coffee in my cup tremble. Ethan and I looked at each other. Only half an hour after Margaret's call, that knock had come like a period punctuating every dark suspicion that had just taken root in my mind. The second knock echoed, firm and deliberate, making the air in the kitchen seem to vibrate. It didn't sound like a neighbor stopping by to wish a happy birthday, nor like a delivery driver in a hurry. 3 beats, steady and sure, the sound of someone who knew exactly what they wanted on the other side of the door. Ethan set his coffee cup down and glanced at me. We didn't say a word, but I knew we were both thinking about the same thing sitting on the table. The gift box. I wiped my hands quickly on my apron and stepped over to open the door. A rush of cold air from the yard swept in, carrying the scent of incoming snow. Standing before me was a woman in a thick navy coat, shoulders squared, eyes steady. A police badge on her chest caught the warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen. Detective Laura Kane, she introduced herself, her voice concise and firm. We need to examine a package that was just delivered to this address. It felt like I had just swallowed a lump of ice. My throat went dry. Ethan stepped forward, stood beside me, and opened the door wider to let her in. Laura entered the kitchen, her gaze immediately locking on the gift box. She slipped on blue nitrile gloves with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times. From her coat pocket, she produced a small folding utility knife, the silver blade flashing under the light. Without a word, she sliced through the brown packing tape, the soft rip of adhesive loud enough to make my heart race. The smell of cellophane and glue rushed out as soon as the lid was lifted. Not just a faint trace, but a dense wave that filled the entire kitchen. I knew that smell. I had once stood close to Claire as she packed boxes exactly like this. Inside were several carefully wrapped art items, a small picture frame, a glass jar containing a metallic powder, a few rolls of printed design paper. Each item had a shipping label with a long tracking code. Laura pulled out a department-issued phone and scanned one of the labels. Her expression shifted slightly. This code matches a shipment under investigation in an interstate smuggling case, she said, her tone even but noticeably colder. Who sent this to you? I hesitated. Ethan's hand rested on my shoulder, like a quiet nudge. I stepped toward the counter, unlocked my phone, and found the call from earlier. My fingers trembled slightly as I put it on speaker. Margaret's voice filled the kitchen, clear as if she were standing right there. Sweetie, did you open it yet? It's a gift of love. No one spoke for a few seconds. Laura tilted her head, as if committing every word to memory. Her gaze moved slowly from the phone to me, then to Ethan. I swallowed hard against the knot in my throat. My mother and my sister, I said, my voice so low it was nearly a whisper. But I think it might not be just a gift. Laura closed the box with a sharp, deliberate motion. She tucked the knife back into her pocket, removed her gloves, and placed them into an evidence bag. When she looked at me again, her voice carried a new gravity. If this is a gift, I don't want to know what an enemy would send. It felt like my feet were cemented to the cold tile floor. Ethan stood beside me, his hand still on my shoulder, but I knew we were both calculating what could come next. Laura gathered her things, keeping the gift box, and left only a business card on the counter. We'll be in touch soon, she said, pausing at the doorway. Her gaze lingered on the dining table, where my coffee cup still sat, steam curling upward. In the meantime, be careful with anything that arrives. And with anyone who sends it. The sound of the door closing echoed into the stillness. I took a deep breath, but the smell of cellophane and glue still clung, seeping into the walls, my sleeves, the wooden seams of the kitchen. As if it had become part of the air, impossible to escape. Ethan picked up the card and slid it into the kitchen drawer. We didn't speak. We just stood there, letting the ticking of the wall clock become the only sound in the room. I thought that knock had been the worst thing to happen today. But I was wrong. Because the phone call that night would be the one to lock me into the game for good. The phone buzzed as I stood in the kitchen, trying to scrub away the scent of cellophane and glue still clinging to my sleeve. I had hoped, though faintly, that this call would bring a decent explanation, or at least a clumsy apology. But the moment I pressed answer, Margaret's voice sliced through whatever fragile hope I had left. Can you keep quiet? Her tone had lost every trace of sweetness, cold as a knife just pulled from the freezer. No greeting. No small talk. Just an order. I froze, the chill from the receiver seeping down into my wrist. Keep quiet about what? And to whom? In the few short seconds that followed, I heard the faint crinkle of cellophane somewhere on her end, a small sound that tightened my stomach. Claire is very fragile, she went on, her voice steady as if she were reading from a prepared script. She can't handle any more pressure. The police have already asked questions, and if they keep going... I heard heavy footsteps join in, and then Paul's deep voice, firm, if they search your place, this all stops. I closed my eyes. That wasn't a suggestion, nor a guess. It was a conclusion. A plan. And I understood instantly they were choosing me as the shield. To take it all. To block whatever they didn't want anyone to see. In my mind, an image of Claire appeared, sitting amid a mountain of brown cardboard boxes, the smell of glue and cellophane curling together like smoke, her eyes narrowing as she smiled. This supplier knows exactly who opens the goods. I gripped the phone tighter. If you can't bear it, then you should bear it, I said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. I didn't shout, didn't shake, but I knew they heard me clearly. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then Margaret's voice dropped, almost hissing through her teeth. You're making things hard for your family, Hannah. Family? I let out a faint laugh, but there was no joy in it. Family doesn't make someone else take the fall. Family doesn't turn their own into a human shield. The air in the kitchen had thickened now, like an unofficial interrogation room. They circled with questions. I cut straight to the answers. They painted a picture of the greater good. I peeled away the layers of pretense, exposing the cold core inside. Paul tried to interject again, his voice sounding as though he was forcing himself to stay calm. Hannah, you have to understand, sometimes someone has to step up. Just once. For everyone. I glanced toward the gift box, now gone with Detective Kane, yet its scent still clung to every seam in the wood, every line in the tile. And now, it had seeped into every word they spoke, coating their sentences like glue sealing a box shut. No, I answered, slow and deliberate. If it's for everyone, then everyone should bear it. Not just me. Another pause. This one longer, heavier. I could hear Margaret exhale sharply, as if she were trying to swallow back bitter words. You'll regret this, she said finally, before hanging up. The long, flat tone rang in my ear, but I stayed where I was, phone still in hand, my palm damp with sweat. Ethan stepped in from the living room, his eyes searching mine. I only shook my head, unable to believe I had just walked out of a conversation where my own blood had pushed me into the role of the accused. I set the phone down on the table and looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall, each flake pure white, breathtaking. But inside, I knew this piece was only a thin shell beneath it were the cracks that, by morning, would begin to show piece by piece. The phone rang late the next morning, just as I was making a strong cup of coffee to chase away the lingering scent of cellophane and glue still hanging in the kitchen. Laura's voice came through the moment I picked up, firm, concise, unmistakable. We have more information. I sank into a chair, both hands gripping the coffee cup as if it were my last anchor. On the other end, Laura spoke quickly, each scattered piece slowly fitting together into a picture I didn't want to see. A business license registered in my name. A shipping contract signed Hannah Miller, the handwriting sloppy but close enough to fool an outsider. And a chain of registration emails using my personal address, sent to a supplier, the very name Ethan had pointed out yesterday. I swallowed hard, the bitterness of the coffee mixing with the astringent taste of betrayal. I didn't sign anything, but the signature is mine. My voice came out hoarse, half as if I were reminding myself, half as if I needed someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. Laura went on, we found traces from another IP address, but using your email. And we spoke to a friend of yours, Lisa? A shiver ran through me. Lisa, my closest friend from college, someone I thought I'd never have to doubt. Laura explained, a few months ago, Claire had asked Lisa to help send some files through my email, claiming her own computer was having issues. Lisa assumed they were just image files or price quotes and agreed. But in reality, Claire had used that email to approve a shipping contract for a shipment, the very one under police investigation. I leaned back in my chair, eyes closed. The smell of cellophane and glue seemed to thicken in the air, wrapping around each of Laura's words. In my mind, I could see Claire bending over a table, yanking the tape tight, sealing each box as if she were wrapping up a secret. And one more thing, Laura hesitated, we interviewed your neighbor Mrs. Thompson. She said that around 5 a.m. on the morning the package arrived, she saw a strange man place a large box on your porch before leaving quickly. She couldn't see his face, but said he wore a dark jacket and a baseball cap. I opened my eyes and looked toward the window. On the porch, where the box had once sat, there was now only a blanket of white snow. But in my memory, I could still see the glint of cellophane catching the dim glow of the street lamp, as if waiting for someone to rip it open. Do you want to press charges? Laura asked, her voice low and steady. I stayed silent for a few seconds. Whatever scraps I'd been holding onto to believe in my family, however small, had shattered. There was no room left for excuses like it must be a misunderstanding or they did it out of love. Love doesn't forge signatures. Love doesn't turn someone's name into a stamp for something illegal. I heard my own voice say, yes. And I want everything documented, every detail. Laura promised to send over the full case file and contact a lawyer. Before hanging up, she warned, be ready. What happens in court will be the end of this game. I set the phone down but remained still. Ethan walked in, resting his hand on my shoulder, silent, as if afraid any words might shatter whatever was suspended between us. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I only felt a cold emptiness spreading, like the snow outside, beautiful, quiet, but covering up the whole truth that had begun to surface. And I knew, from this moment on, I would never look at my family the same way again. The county courthouse was packed that day. The click of high heels on the tiled floor, the rustle of papers, and the low murmur of conversations hung over the room like a low cloud. I sat in the third row, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, feeling as if every eye in the room was fixed on me. On the table before me, a thick stack of files sat neatly clipped together, but inside was everything my family had done. When the judge began to speak, his voice echoed through the tall, cold space. The name Hannah Reed, just 3 words, but I heard them 11 times throughout the reading of the verdict. Each time it rang out, it was like the strike of a gavel, not to convict me, but to etch into memory that my name had once been used as a tool for things I had never even touched. Claire stood at the defendant's stand, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes avoiding mine. Her lawyer had negotiated for her to plead guilty to fraud and identity theft, in exchange for 2 years probation and a fine large enough to force her to sell half her assets. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, Claire simply replied, no explanation. No apology. Margaret and Paul, The ones who used to call me daughter in front of everyone now stood at the stand, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes indifferent. They pled guilty as accomplices, sentenced to probation and ordered to perform community service. Margaret's expression never changed, as if this were merely a bureaucratic formality. Paul only glanced at me now and then, his gaze empty, impossible to tell whether it was regret or simply waiting to go home. In the corner of the room, I spotted a reporter from the local paper taking notes. I knew that by tomorrow, my name and the events of today would be in print, accompanied by a distant photo probably of me leaving the courthouse, head slightly bowed. But I also knew that no matter how far the story spread, not a single word would carry the meaning of "I'm sorry." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. The scent of glossy paper and glue came rushing back, as if I were being pulled backward through time to the morning I opened that fateful box. But now, it was no longer just a small detail, it was a permanent stain, a mark clinging stubbornly to my memory. When the judge declared the trial concluded, I rose to my feet. My steps were heavy but steady. I walked past Claire, close enough for her to hear me, but I kept my voice low and clear. "My name is not something you get to borrow." Claire flinched slightly, her lips pressing together more tightly, but she said nothing. Outside the courthouse, it was already midday. The cold winter sunlight stretched across the stone steps. Ethan was waiting, holding a thick coat in his hands. He draped it over my shoulders without a word, then gently took my hand. That squeeze wasn't to hurry me along, it was to remind me that I still had something solid to hold on to. We walked slowly through the cluster of reporters, the click of camera shutters, someone calling my name. I didn't stop, didn't look around. All along the way, I heard only the wind curling around us, biting cold yet carrying away what little was left from those months of manipulation. By afternoon, the online news had already posted the story. The headline was simple: 3 sentenced in shipping fraud case using another person's identity. There was no mention of the sleepless nights, the hours spent explaining myself to the police, or the scrutinizing stares from neighbors. No apology. No acknowledgement of the damage done to me. Just another case closed. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the streetlight spill onto the layer of snow in the yard. Ethan brought me a cup of hot tea, the scent of chamomile weaving into my breath. I thought about everything that had happened and realized my feelings were a strange mixed relief that the truth had come to light, but bitterness at losing a family, even if it was one full of cracks. I leaned my forehead against the cold window frame, listening to my breath fade into the quiet. Some stories, no matter how they end, will never truly be happy in the usual sense. But at least I knew I had stood my ground and held on to my name until the very end. And somewhere in that stillness, I understood. I needed one last meeting. The small cafe on the corner across from the courthouse still carried the lingering scent of freshly baked pastries, but the air between the 3 of us at the corner table was as thick and solid as a block of ice. I sat across from Margaret and Paul, the cappuccino in front of me still steaming, a thin swirl of foam resting on top. Outside the window, the street moved along slowly, but in here, every second seemed to stretch itself out. Margaret spoke first, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. I didn't know this was that serious." She slowly stirred the small spoon in her black coffee, her eyes fixed on the dark liquid as if searching for an answer in it. I looked straight at her, no nod, no shake of the head letting the silence answer for me, in place of all the times I'd heard this before, a denial of responsibility, wrapped in a tone of false sympathy. Paul sat beside her, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded across his chest. He didn't look at me, just said, as if commenting on the weather, "I thought you could handle it." Handle it. Those 2 words landed on the table like a small stone, but their echo dragged with it memories of every time I'd been pushed into handling it to keep the peace, to avoid making a big deal. I took a slow breath, the heat from the cappuccino seeping into my hands, in sharp contrast to the cold that was rising in my chest. "I don't think, if you can handle it, you should have to." My voice was low and steady, each word placed deliberately on the table between us. Margaret's head lifted, her eyes blinking quickly as if searching for an escape route, but there wasn't one. Paul stayed silent, his lips pressed together, his gaze still averted. I realized, in this entire conversation, not a single question had been asked of me. No one had asked how I felt, what I had lost, or what I had gone through. And in my mind, a sentence I'd never spoken before rang clear: not asking means agreeing. Agreeing to stay silent, agreeing to let injustice pass, agreeing to let someone else take the weight for you. I let go of the cappuccino cup. The steam still curled upward, mingling with the rich aroma of coffee, but I knew I wouldn't take another sip. That cup, still hot, would stay here, a full stop to whatever this family was that I had tried to hold on to. I stood, pulling my chair back just enough for the soft creak to break the stillness of the cafe, but not so loud as to shatter it, just enough for Margaret and Paul to know I would not be sitting down again. Margaret called out softly, "Hannah," but her voice was swallowed up by the whir of the coffee grinder behind the counter. I didn't turn around. Stepping outside, the winter air rushed in, sharp enough to sting my eyes, yet still warmer than the chill from the looks and words inside. On the walk home, I couldn't remember how many intersections or red lights I'd passed. I only remembered the faint scent of coffee clinging to my sleeve, a contradiction warm, yet stripped of all meaning. The next morning, I woke up to a new kind of emptiness. No more sudden phone calls, no more sideways glances at the grocery store, and no part of me still waiting for an explanation or an apology. There was only me, my steady breathing, and a day just beginning. And somewhere in that space, I felt lighter. That morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, soft and golden like honey, laying warm streaks across the wooden table. The scent of coffee drifted lightly through the air, mingling with the quiet, the kind of quiet I hadn't had in years. I sat in my familiar chair, took a sip of hot coffee, and felt the warmth spread from the tip of my tongue all the way down to my chest. In front of me, on the shelf by the front door, there was still an empty space where the box used to sit. That space, once a constant reminder of unease, was now a sign of a new boundary, a boundary I had built to protect myself. No more unexpected doorbells in the early morning. No more little notes that said "just holding this for me," or anonymous packages that would later turn into evidence against me. No more words spoken with a friendly tone but carrying hidden demands or pressure. Just an ordinary morning, and to me, that was precious enough to treasure. I realized that freedom isn't always about going somewhere new, but about reclaiming the space within yourself, the space that isn't filled with demands, responsibilities, or obligations others impose on you. That space is where I can breathe deeply without fear. As the morning light streamed deeper into the kitchen, I faced a truth I had once been afraid to admit: I don't owe anyone the sacrifice of my life. For years, I had been convinced that enduring was a virtue, that patience was what made me a good person. But now I know that true goodness doesn't come from letting yourself be used. It comes from knowing your limits, from knowing when to say no. I thought back to what I said in that coffee shop that day: if you can endure it, then you should. And today, I want to change it a little for myself. No is a complete answer. No justification needed. No explanation required. Just no. I set my coffee cup down, letting the lingering warmth on my fingertips remind me that real warmth has to begin from within. Outside, the light was shifting, each golden ray stretching the shadows across the floor. Every new day was another chance to live without needing anyone's permission to be myself. If this story makes you think about your own boundaries, share it. Someone out there might be needing a reason to say no today. And if you'd like to keep hearing stories that help you reclaim your own voice, you can leave a comment or give this video a like. Who knows, maybe the next story will speak to exactly what you've been searching for. Because sometimes, the light of freedom doesn't come from the doors you open, but from the very door you choose to close. If you want to join me on the journeys ahead, subscribe so when the next door opens, we can step through it together.